Platte River Valley, Nebraska Territory, May 1867. While neighboring homesteaders completed their split rail fences in 8 to 10 days, using 180 to 200 rails, Jacob Hartmann was entering his ninth week of fence construction with only half his property enclosed. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He was building a fence that stood 56 inches high, 14 inches taller than standard frontier construction, consuming rails at a rate that made experienced settlers shake their heads in disbelief. The massive fence system required 420 rails for the same distance his neighbors enclosed with 240 rails, demanding materials that represented weeks of additional labor and significant cash expenditure in a territory where every dollar meant the difference between success and failure. Thomas Brennan, whose own fence followed the proven six-rail design that had served Irish homesteaders throughout the territories, found himself walking over to observe Hartmann's progress with increasing bewilderment. "That fence'll cost him twice what mine did. For nothing," he told his wife Mary one evening, watching Jacob carefully sink another cedar post 3 feet into the prairie soil. "We're talking about containing milk cows, not building fortifications." The criticism carried weight in a community where efficient resource allocation meant survival. Brennan's fence had required exactly 9 days of construction time, employed standard 18-inch post depth, and functioned perfectly for livestock containment at a material cost of $28. Henry Walsh, the settlement's leader and former Union Army quartermaster whose Civil War logistics experience had taught him the value of practical resource management, brought military precision to the growing skepticism. Walsh had founded the Platte River settlement in 1864 by applying battlefield principles to frontier organization: establish adequate shelter quickly, conserve scarce materials, follow methods proven by previous generations of successful settlers. Hartmann's approach violated every principle of efficient frontier construction. Come cattle season, Walsh predicted to the assembled men at the settlement's informal Sunday gatherings, he'll wish he had more land fenced and less money buried in unnecessary engineering. Pete Donovan, the territory's primary rail splitter, who had supplied materials for 40 homesteads throughout the region, refused to provide additional rails beyond standard quantities. "I'm not throwing good timber after bad ideas," Donovan declared, when Hartmann requested the extended order of 420 rails. "6 rails high is plenty for any livestock. 8 rails is just waste he'll regret when he needs to expand his property." Donovan's professional authority carried weight. His experience splitting rails for frontier construction throughout Nebraska Territory represented practical knowledge that most newcomers relied upon without question. The mathematical burden of Hartmann's design became increasingly apparent as spring progressed. Where conventional fences required posts every 11 feet, allowing reasonable material economy, Hartmann was methodically placing posts every 7 feet. Each post measured 8 inches in diameter and 7 feet in total length, requiring hand-hewn shaping from premium cedar timber. The posts alone represented labor that consumed 2 full weeks beyond standard construction timelines. His corner bracing system defied all frontier logic, employing 12 additional rails per corner in an elaborate double X pattern that neighbors had never witnessed in practical fence construction. Settlement families completed spring planting while Hartmann continued splitting rails and digging post holes to his excessive specifications. His wife Anna expressed concern about delayed crop establishment, noting that their garden remained unprotected, while Jacob persisted with fence perfection that seemed to serve no practical purpose. The Hartmann children hauled posts and stacked rails, while neighboring families' children already worked established fields, protected by adequate, sensible fencing completed 2 months earlier. Jacob responded to community criticism with technical explanations that revealed knowledge sources unfamiliar to most American settlers. Posts must reach below frost line to resist lateral force, he told Brennan during one conversation, his German accent still pronounced after 3 years in the territories. Deep posts and close spacing create mutual support system. Each post reinforces the next. The analogy seemed reasonable in the engineering theory, but the practical reality of consuming 11 weeks and $47 for fence construction that neighbors accomplished in 9 days for $28 struck most homesteaders as impractical old-world thinking, poorly adapted to frontier realities. By early July, the contrast between Hartmann's unfinished project and his neighbors' completed fences became a source of settlement conversation and cautionary lessons about European overcomplication meeting American common sense. By August 1867, Hartmann's fence stood completed, a monument to over-engineering that drew visitors from neighboring homesteads, who came to marvel at what they called the German's fortress fence. The finished structure defied every convention of practical frontier construction. Where standard split-rail fences rose 42 inches from ground level, adequate height for containing cattle and horses throughout the territories, Hartmann's barrier towered at 56 inches. High enough to stop a horse, neighbors joked, when a cow won't even try to jump. The posts sank 36 inches into prairie soil, twice the 18-inch depth that served every other homestead in the valley. Digging to China for a split-rail fence, Pete Donovan remarked to anyone within earshot, shaking his head at the wasted effort. The rail count told the story most, dramatically. 8 rails stacked vertically compared to the standard 6, representing 2 rails he'll never need, according to Thomas Brennan's assessment. Post spacing at 7-foot intervals instead of the conventional 11 feet meant Hartmann could have fenced twice the land with the same materials, a mathematical reality that Henry Walsh documented in his settlement records as an example of poor resource allocation. The corner bracing system mystified experienced builders. Hartmann's double X pattern employed 12 additional rails per corner, creating elaborate triangulated structures where simple stake and rider arrangements had served frontier fencing for generations. Walsh conducted a formal cost analysis that became settlement conversation throughout August. Hartmann's fence required $47 in materials and labor, calculated at 1867 frontier rates. Brennan's standard fence, enclosing identical linear distance, cost $28 in materials and labor. The $19 overpayment represented a significant sum for cash-poor homesteaders operating on annual incomes of $200 to $300. For families where every expenditure required careful justification, Hartmann's fence stood as a cautionary example of expensive foreign thinking, poorly adapted to American practicality. Visitors tested both fence structures during informal gatherings. Brennan's standard fence flexed noticeably when pushed by a grown man's weight, movement that everyone agreed was normal and acceptable. The rails gave slightly, posts rocked in their 18-inch holes, but the overall structure maintained integrity adequate for livestock containment. Hartmann's fence didn't budge under identical pressure. Solid as a barn wall, observers noted, which struck everyone as entirely unnecessary engineering for a simple property boundary designed to contain animals that rarely tested fencing under normal conditions. Hartmann attempted technical explanations that fell on skeptical ears. He demonstrated triangulation principles learned during his apprenticeship in the Palatinate region, showing how corner bracing distributed force across multiple connection points, rather than concentrating stress on single stakes. He explained how buried post depth resisted lateral force through leverage mathematics, preventing the toppling motion that shallow posts experienced under sustained pressure. His references to Rhine Valley vineyard fencing that withstood downslope soil pressure for decades seemed irrelevant to Nebraska prairie conditions where such extreme forces never materialized. Brennan provided the community consensus during an evening gathering at the settlement meeting house. "We're not building cathedrals, Jacob. It's a fence." The statement drew approving nods from men who had successfully enclosed their properties using methods proven across generations of American frontier expansion. Walsh added military perspective refined through quartermaster experience managing Union Army supply lines. Military specification for a cow pasture. That's German efficiency for you. Donovan concluded the assessment with rail splitter authority. All that work, and the cows don't care one bit. Anna Hartmann defended her husband during women's conversations at the settlement well. He builds to last, like everything he does, she told Mary Brennan, referencing the storm-resistant barn Jacob had constructed the previous winter, while neighbors' barns required extensive repair after February ice storms. But even Anna's loyalty couldn't overcome the mathematical evidence that her husband had consumed 11 weeks and 19 excess dollars on fence construction that provided no observable advantage over structures built in 9 days at conventional cost. September approached, bringing peak cattle drive season, when 600 to 1,000 head passed monthly along the overland trail running through the valley. Hartmann quietly noted that his fence line faced the primary trail approach, positioned 80 feet from the main cattle route. Neighbors dismissed this observation as irrelevant, since drives passed peacefully under drover control, presenting no threat to properly constructed fencing of any specification. The massive herds moved steadily through settled areas, following established procedures that had functioned safely for years. Hartmann's fence stood as the most overbuilt structure in the Platte River Valley, a testament to Old World excess meeting New World practicality, according to everyone except its builder, who continued maintaining his elaborate corners and checking his deep-set posts with methodical German precision that seemed entirely wasted on a simple split-rail fence. September 3rd brought a massive Texas cattle drive through the valley. 800 longhorns with 12 drovers heading to the Union Pacific railhead at North Platte. Trail boss Cooper Matthews had experience managing large herds, but 2 of his drovers had fallen sick in Julesburg, leaving his crew undermanned for controlling animals that had grown increasingly restless during the journey north. The afternoon heat reached 94 degrees, with oppressive humidity unusual for Nebraska territory in early autumn. The cattle had gone 36 hours without proper water, and drought-affected grasslands provided poor grazing that left the herd agitated and nervous. Weather signs appeared throughout the afternoon. Towering clouds built on the western horizon, their tops reaching heights that promised severe thunderstorms by evening. Settlement families watched the massive herd pass their properties, noting the nervous energy rippling through 800 animals that represented nearly 1 million pounds of moving mass stretched over half a mile of trail. Each longhorn averaged 1,200 pounds, horns spanning 4 to 5 feet, capable of tremendous destructive force when panicked. Matthews stationed his drovers strategically along the herd's flanks, but with men spread thin, gaps appeared in the coverage that would prove critical as conditions deteriorated. Standard cattle drive procedure called for keeping herds moving steadily through settled areas, avoiding overnight stops near homesteads where nervous animals might damage property or disturb livestock. Matthews intended to push through the valley before nightfall, a reasonable plan under normal conditions. But these were not normal conditions. The cattle showed increasing agitation as the storm approached, led steers resisting forward movement and bunching up rather than maintaining the steady progress that characterized well-managed drives. Hartmann's property bordered the trail at the closest point, his fence line running 80 feet from the main cattle route. Brennan's adjacent property shared identical trail proximity, both homesteads positioned where stampeding cattle would naturally flow if the herd broke from drover control. 5 other homesteads lay within a quarter mile, all protected by standard fencing that had never faced testing beyond routine livestock containment. The properties contained mixed livestock worth $200 to $300 per family, milk cows and oxen and horses and pigs, representing months or years of careful investment. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the first warning signs became unmistakable. Lightning appeared on the western horizon, 15 miles distant. Brilliant flashes against darkening clouds that drew the cattle's attention. The animals began lowing, heads rising, milling rather than moving forward in organized fashion. Matthews directed his crew to spread the herd, reducing density that could amplify panic. But the undermanned drovers struggled to maintain control as wind began gusting from the south. By 6:15, the storm's approach transformed atmospheric conditions with frightening speed. Wind shifted suddenly from south to northwest, the classic pre-storm pattern that every plainsman recognized as danger. Temperature dropped 12 degrees in 20 minutes, the sudden cooling shocking after afternoon heat. The cattle grew openly nervous, their agitation visible from settlement cabins, where families began bringing children inside and securing loose animals in barns. Matthews made the decision to push through before the storm hit, knowing that keeping the herd moving offered better safety than stopping animals in this increasingly volatile state. The storm arrived at 7 o'clock with violence that exceeded normal September weather patterns. Lightning struck within 2 miles, followed immediately by sharp thunder cracks rather than the distant rumbles of ordinary storms. Rain came suddenly and heavily, reducing visibility to 100 feet and turning the trail into confusion. Wind gusted to 35 and 40 miles per hour, driving rain horizontally across the prairie and into the faces of cattle that had already reached the breaking point of their tolerance. At 7:12, lightning struck a cottonwood tree 200 yards from the herd's front section. The simultaneous thunder crack exploded across the valley like artillery fire. 800 longhorns erupted into panicked stampede, exploding northeast in blind terror directly towards settled homesteads, where families took shelter inside cabins. Matthews and his drovers attempted desperately to turn the herd, but 12 men could not control 800 animals, running at 15 to 20 miles per hour through rain and darkness. The ground-shaking rumble reached cabins before the visual confirmation, a sound like continuous thunder rolling across the prairie. Through rain-streaked windows, settlers saw the dark mass approaching. The Germans' overbuilt fence stood directly in the stampede path. Brennan thought that fancy fence wouldn't matter now. Nothing stops 800 longhorns in full panic. Hartmann watched silently, thinking that everything depended on whether the corner bracing would hold, under forces he had calculated theoretically, but never tested in reality. 90 seconds remained before impact. The first wave of longhorns hit Hartmann's fence line at precisely 7, 12, and 45 seconds, striking the southwest corner, where his double X pattern bracing system concentrated maximum structural strength. 40 to 50 head collided with the fence nearly simultaneously, each 1,200-pound animal moving at 18 miles per hour, generating approximately 2,400 pounds of impact force. The total lateral pressure on the 80-foot fence section exceeded 100,000 pounds, force sufficient to demolish standard frontier construction in seconds. The sound of impact carried across the valley over the storm noise, an explosive crack of horns and bodies against rails that families heard inside their cabins with terrifying clarity. The fence flexed inward 6 to 8 inches under the assault, rails bowing under pressure that would have shattered conventional construction. But Hartmann's posts held. The 36-inch buried depth provided leverage resistance that 18-inch posts could never achieve, and the 7-foot spacing created mutual support, where each post reinforced its neighbors rather than standing alone. The corner bracing absorbed force through triangulated distribution, spreading impact across 6 connection points, instead of concentrating stress on single stakes. Bottom rails bent dramatically, but didn't break, and the 8-rail height meant that, even as lower rails bowed, upper rails remained intact and functional. The leading cattle recoiled from the unexpected solid barrier, their forward momentum broken by resistance they hadn't anticipated. The herd began turning along the fence line rather than breaking through, following the barrier northeast as a guide. Matthews and his drovers seized the opportunity, pushing the turn and using Hartmann's fence as an accidental control structure that channeled 800 panicked animals away from settled property and back toward open prairie. 200 feet south, a secondary branch of the Stampede hit Brennan's standard fence with catastrophic results. 3 rails snapped immediately on first contact, the 6-rail height providing insufficient depth to absorb impact. Posts with 18-inch burial depth toppled under lateral torque, pulling completely free of prairie soil that couldn't resist the massive force. A 30-foot gap opened in seconds. 60 to 80 cattle poured through onto Brennan property, trampling everything in their path. The family's milk cows and oxen scattered in panic. One ox took a horn through the shoulder, a goring that would cost $35 in lost value. The vegetable garden that Mary Brennan had tended through the summer disappeared under hundreds of hooves. The chicken coop exploded into splinters, dead birds scattered across trampled ground. Inside the Hartmann cabin, Anna clutched their children while Jacob watched through the window in silence. He could see the fence bowing but holding, rails bent but functional, posts leaning but anchored. "The corner bracing is working," he whispered, his voice carrying relief that 3 months of criticized labor had proven justified. Inside the Brennan cabin, Thomas watched his fence collapse and cattle flood his property, while Mary cried and children screamed. Years of careful investment trampled in minutes, losses mounting with every passing second. From his elevated cabin position, Henry Walsh observed the differential outcome with the analytical precision his military training had developed. Hartmann's fence channeled the Stampede away from his property, maintaining structural integrity under forces that no standard frontier fence could withstand. Brennan's fence failed catastrophically, the conventional construction proving entirely inadequate for extreme conditions that everyone had assumed would never arrive. The main herd passed Hartmann's fence line in 4 minutes of sustained pressure that never produced a breach. By 7:16, the majority of cattle had redirected northeast. Matthews and his crew successfully completed the turn by 7:20. The Stampede, exhausting itself as animals, scattered across open prairie away from settled homesteads. The storm continued, but lightning was passing, allowing settlers to emerge cautiously and assess the damage their properties had sustained. Hartmann's fence stood battered but intact. 3 bottom rails showed cracks, but remained in position, still functional for livestock containment. 1 post leaned 15 degrees from vertical, but hadn't broken or pulled free. No breach existed anywhere along the fence line. No cattle had penetrated his property. His livestock stood undisturbed in their pasture, his buildings untouched, his investment protected. Total damage estimate for repairs amounted to $4 in a rail replacement. Brennan's property told a different story. 40 feet of fence lay destroyed, rails splintered and scattered 50 feet from their original positions, posts uprooted and broken. 1 ox injured with a gored shoulder worth $35. 2 milk cows missing, likely run off in the chaos, representing $40 in lost value. The garden completely destroyed, $15 in estimated crop loss. The demolished chicken coop and 12 dead birds added another $8 to mounting losses. Total damage reached $98, more than 3 times what Hartmann's excessive fence had cost to build. Neighbors gathered at the property line where rain still fell steadily. The contrast was undeniable. Hartmann's fence stood with bent rails and leaning posts, but maintained its barrier function. Brennan's fence existed as scattered wreckage, a gap wide enough to drive a wagon through, marking where 800 longhorns had proven conventional wisdom catastrophically wrong. Henry Walsh, soaked and surveying the scene with military assessment precision, spoke the words everyone was thinking. "Gentlemen, I believe we owe Jacob an apology." Clear skies on September 5th revealed the full scope of differential outcomes that neighbors had witnessed during 4 terrifying minutes the previous evening. Settlers gathered at Hartmann's fence line to examine the structure that had performed impossibly, holding against forces that conventional wisdom insisted no split-rail fence could withstand. Henry Walsh applied his military engineering mindset to systematic analysis, conducting an investigation that would transform community understanding of what proper fence construction actually required. The corner bracing discovery came first. Standard corners throughout the settlement used single diagonal stakes adequate for normal livestock pressure, but nothing more. Hartmann's double X pattern, with 12 rails, created triangulated force distribution that Walsh recognized from battlefield fortification principles. Impact force that would topple single-braced corners instead spread across 6 connection points, each absorbing a fraction of total pressure rather than any single point bearing catastrophic load. It's not one corner, Walsh explained to assembled neighbors. It's a structural system. Each corner reinforces the next. The engineering principle seemed obvious once demonstrated, yet no one had thought to apply it to frontier fencing before witnessing its necessity. Post depth provided the second revelation. Thomas Brennan's posts, at 18 inches buried, had pulled completely from the ground, prairie soil unable to resist lateral torque applied by stampeding cattle. Pete Donovan, the rail splitter who had refused to support Hartmann's excessive specifications, dug beside both types of posts to compare their holding mechanisms. Twice the depth means 4 times the holding force, Donovan admitted, his voice carrying the weight of professional reassessment. It's leverage mathematics I should have understood from the beginning. The 36-inch posts had transformed soil resistance through basic physics that became undeniable once tested under extreme conditions. Post spacing completed the technical understanding. Standard 11-foot spacing meant each post worked independently, and when one failed, adjacent sections collapsed in cascade effect. Hartmann's 7-foot spacing created mutual support, where adjacent posts reinforced each other through shared load distribution. Heinrich Werner, a German neighbor who had remained neutral during construction criticism, provided the analogy that clarified the principle for everyone. It's like a Roman arch. Individual pieces become stronger together than any single piece could be alone. Walsh calculated the economic realities that gave mathematical weight to engineering validation. Hartmann's $19 overspend had prevented $94 in Stampede damage on Brennan's property alone. A 5-to-1 return on investment from a single incident, with potential for multiple events over 10 years of frontier cattle drive exposure. The expected value of robust fencing far exceeded its cost, a calculation Walsh documented in settlement records that would influence building decisions throughout the territory. Settlement-wide damage assessment provided compelling comparative data. Hartmann sustained $4 in damage. Brennan suffered $98 in losses that would require months to recover. 2 other homesteads with standard fencing experienced partial breaches costing $35 and $52 respectively. Total community damage reached $189, with only Hartmann's property remaining untouched by the stampede that had devastated conventional construction throughout the valley. Thomas Brennan stood examining his destroyed fence section with the hard-won wisdom of expensive experience. "I saved $19 in May," he told anyone who would listen. "Cost me $98 in September. That's frontier mathematics I should have thought through better." His injured ox required care from a traveling veterinarian, adding another $6 to losses that kept mounting. Mary Brennan, normally supportive of her husband's practical approach, observed quietly that perhaps German over-engineering wasn't so wasteful after all, a sentiment that spread through women's conversations at the settlement well. Knowledge transfer began immediately. 3 neighbors approached Hartmann on September 8th, requesting technical consultations on corner bracing construction details, post-depth requirements for stampede-prone areas, and rail spacing calculations for different pressure scenarios. Hartmann conducted a fence-building workshop at his property, demonstrating post-hole digging techniques for 36-inch depth that required different tools and methods. than standard construction. He laid out full double X bracing patterns on the ground, explaining force vectors using principles learned during his Palatinate apprenticeship. He showed rail selection methods, choosing straight-grained stock that flexed under pressure without breaking rather than brittle rails that snapped on impact. Walsh made public admission that carried weight throughout the settlement. I evaluated his fence using peacetime specifications, he told assembled families at the meeting house. He built for wartime conditions and war arrived. Donovan apologized directly to Hartmann, offering to supply materials at cost for repairs and new construction, acknowledging that his professional judgment had failed to account for extreme events that frontier fencing must occasionally withstand. Heinrich Werner provided old-world perspective that resonated with Americans reconsidering their assumptions about proper building methods. In the old country, we build for centuries, he said. Americans build for speed. Jacob remembered the old way, and it saved everything he owns. Economic ripple effects spread immediately. Brennan began fence reconstruction using Hartmann specifications, accepting a timeline extending to 6 weeks instead of his original 8 days. 2 other families completely rebuilt fence sections that had failed during the Stampede. Material demand spiked, and Donovan's rail splitting business saw orders increase 200% as settlers throughout the region began questioning whether their own fences could withstand similar testing. Settlement families calculated risk exposure using Walsh's documented framework. Average property value reached $800 to $1,200 in land, buildings, livestock, and equipment. Stampede risk stood at roughly 1 in 5 chance over 10 years, based on cattle drive frequency along the overland trail. Expected loss with standard fencing averaged $50 to $100 per incident. Robust fence premium cost $15 to $25. The economic justification became clear even to the most cost-conscious homesteaders, who had initially criticized Hartmann's excessive investment. An evening gathering at the settlement meeting house formalized the community transformation. Walsh proposed establishing Hartmann's fence specifications as recommended community standard for properties within half a mile of cattle trails. The vote produced unanimous approval. Brennan addressed the group with words that captured the collective reassessment everyone had undergone. I called his fence stupid, he said. Turns out the only stupid thing was building cheap when we should have built right. The construction boom began immediately. 8 homesteads within the Platte River settlement, starting fence reconstruction using Hartmann's specifications between September and November 1867. Families accepted timeline shifts that transformed fencing from 10-day projects into 8 to 12-week undertakings, recognizing that speed had been purchased at the cost of adequacy. Pete Donovan expanded his rail-splitting operation, hiring 2 assistants to meet demand that had increased 300% overnight. Cedar post requests multiplied as settlers prioritized durability over economy, understanding that proper materials represented investment rather than expense. Thomas Brennan tore down the remaining 600 feet of his standard fence, rebuilding everything to full Hartmann specifications with 8 rails high, 7-foot post spacing, and double X corners at every angle. The reconstruction consumed 7 weeks compared to his original 8 days, costing $51 against his initial $28 investment. $23 more, Brennan told neighbors who questioned the expense. But I'll sleep better during cattle season. His conversion from skeptic to advocate carried particular weight, given his public losses during the Stampede that had proven conventional wisdom catastrophically inadequate. Henry Walsh rebuilt the trail-facing side of his property using Hartmann specifications, while maintaining standard fencing on protected sides where Stampede risk remained minimal. He applied military engineering documentation principles to the process, creating written specifications with detailed diagrams that he distributed to incoming settlers as unofficial settlement standards. The documentation transformed informal knowledge into systematic guidelines that new homesteaders could follow without requiring direct consultation with Hartmann, spreading best practices beyond personal instruction limitations. Hartmann continued refining his methods through the winter of 1867 and 1868, developing intermediate specifications for lower-risk fence sections that balanced cost with strength. His 7-rail design with 9-foot post spacing provided enhanced durability over standard construction while reducing material requirements compared to full stampede-resistant specifications. He created post-setting jigs that accelerated 36-inch hole digging by 40%, addressing the timeline concerns that had initially fueled community criticism. His experiments with different corner bracing patterns identified optimal rail counts and angle configurations that maximize strength while minimizing material waste. Community collaboration enhanced the technical evolution beyond Hartmann's individual innovations. Heinrich Werner contributed German wire binding techniques for rail connections that increased joint strength without additional lumber. Donovan developed improved rail splitting methods, producing more consistent straight-grained stock that flexed under pressure rather than fracturing. The local blacksmith created specialized post-hole augers designed specifically for 36-inch depth work, reducing digging time by half and eliminating the timeline objections that had made deep post construction seem impractical during initial skepticism. Regional spread occurred rapidly through word-of-mouth reputation carried by cattlemen who had witnessed the September Stampede. Trail boss Cooper Matthews described the German fence in Nebraska that stopped 800 head cold at railhead towns throughout the territories, creating demand from homesteaders along cattle routes who recognized their vulnerability to similar incidents. By 1870, Hartmann pattern fencing appeared in 14 settlements along the Overland Trail in Nebraska Territory, 8 communities in eastern Colorado Territory along the Denver-Cheyenne corridor, and 5 Kansas settlements near cattle shipping points. Federal territorial reports documented the spread, noting that improved fencing had reduced stampede damage by approximately 60% in regions where adoption had occurred. Economic documentation from 1868 through 1870 provided quantifiable validation that convinced even skeptics who had dismissed engineering principles as unnecessary complexity. 3 additional stampede incidents occurred in the region during this period, creating natural experiments that compared fence performance under identical conditions. Properties with Hartmann pattern fencing averaged $6 damage per incident. Properties with standard fencing averaged $73 damage per incident. The 12-to-1 performance differential eliminated any remaining debate about whether robust construction justified its additional cost. Territorial insurance companies began offering 15% premium reductions for certified Hartmann pattern fencing by 1872, creating financial incentives beyond direct stampede protection. The market validation demonstrated that private enterprise recognized value that initial community skepticism had failed to appreciate. Walsh documented this development in settlement records with observation that captured the transformation. The market has validated what Jacob understood through engineering, he wrote. Economics confirms what physics proved during 4 minutes in September 1867. Educational formalization came when Walsh published specifications for robust frontier fencing in the Nebraska Territorial Gazette in 1872, including detailed diagrams drawn by Hartmann with material calculations, construction timelines, and cost estimates. The document became reference material for territorial land offices advising new settlers, spreading standardized knowledge throughout regions where cattle drives created stampede risk. The publication transformed local innovation into territorial best practice, ensuring that future homesteaders would benefit from lessons learned through expensive trial and error in the Platte River Valley. By 1875, data from the original settlement provided compelling long-term validation. Zero Stampede-related fence failures had occurred since 1867, despite 8 cattle drives, passing within a quarter mile of improved properties. Average fence maintenance costs ran $2 annually compared to $8 to $12 for standard fencing requiring frequent repair after normal wear and weather exposure. Property values increased 15% above comparable non-improved homesteads, an appreciation that real estate assessors attributed directly to infrastructure quality that protected investment against catastrophic loss. The Hartmann family prospered beyond simple vindication of building methods. Jacob's reputation as master builder generated consultation income of $3 to $5 per day as technical advisor to homesteaders throughout the territory. Additional contracts for barn and bridge construction followed, clients seeking engineering expertise that had proven reliable under extreme testing. The family children apprenticed in construction trades, using their father's principles, spreading knowledge into the next generation of territorial builders. The settlement commemorated the 10-year anniversary in 1878 with formal recognition that acknowledged Hartmann's contribution to community survival. Walsh presented an engraved brass plaque reading, "To Jacob Hartmann, whose engineering wisdom protected this settlement. His fence held when others failed." 1867. Hartmann's response, recorded in settlement minutes, captured the philosophy that had guided his controversial construction decisions. "I built what needed building," he said. "A fence should do more than mark boundaries. It should protect what lies within them." That is not German thinking or American thinking. That is simply correct thinking. By 1880, Nebraska territorial surveys documented Hartmann pattern fencing on over 200 homesteads throughout regions exposed to cattle drive routes. Construction timelines of 6 to 8 weeks had become accepted as normal for quality fencing, and material costs stabilized at 40 to 50% above basic construction, regarded as reasonable investment rather than wasteful excess. Zero fence failures occurred during Stampede events, where Hartmann's specifications had been properly followed, providing statistical validation that transformed skepticism into standard practice. The technical principles Hartmann introduced influenced later barbed wire fencing design when that technology arrived in the late 1870s. Post spacing and depth standards carried forward into wire fence construction. Corner bracing concepts adapted to wire tension systems that required similar force distribution principles. His emphasis on engineering over speed became accepted frontier philosophy that influenced infrastructure development throughout the Great Plains as settlement density increased and property protection became increasingly critical to economic success. Visitors to the Platte River Valley in the 1880s could distinguish improved homesteads by their distinctive 8-rail fences with double X corners, silent testimony to one immigrant's refusal to sacrifice engineering principles for frontier expediency. The stupid split-rail fence that neighbors had mocked in 1867 became the regional standard for trail-adjacent properties throughout the Plains territories, proving that the difference between waste and wisdom often reveals itself only when systems face their ultimate test. Jacob Hartmann's neighbors learned this lesson during 4 terrifying minutes in September 1867, when 800 Longhorns taught the settlement that building right costs less than rebuilding wrong.